The folks in Dry Creek swore no one would last a night in the Miller cabin. Boards groaned like dying men, the loft carried whispers, and more than one rider claimed to see boots pacing where no living soul stood. But when Clara Hale laid down her last $50, she didn't just buy a roof and 4 rotten walls, she bought every ghost and every debt tied to that ground. On her first night, the fire barely kept back the dark when she heard it, breathing that wasn't her own. The summer sun had long since sunk below the ridges, leaving the desert sky washed in lavender and deep indigo. The land outside the tiny town of Dry Creek was hushed, save for the occasional yip of a coyote or the dry rattle of wind dragging itself over the sage. On the far edge of town, where the last wooden fences gave way to an ocean of mesquite and dust, a lone cabin leaned crooked against the horizon. Its timbers were split and silvered with age, its windows boarded, its door hanging from one stubborn hinge. Folks in town called it the Miller cabin, though nobody alive remembered the Millers, not really. Some whispered the place was cursed, others that it was simply unlucky ground. For decades, nobody dared buy it, not even for lumber, until she came along. Her name was Clara Hale, and she'd arrived in Dry Creek with nothing but a trunk, a mule, and the kind of hard-set jaw that meant she wasn't the type to spook easy. She was 34, hair the color of red clay, eyes sharp as a hawk's, and hands worn from work. When the auctioneer rattled off $50, no more, no less, for the Miller place, Clara lifted her hand before anyone else could blink. Nobody tried to outbid her. Nobody wanted it. A murmur passed through the gathered townsfolk, part curiosity, part pity. A woman alone, with barely 2 nickels to rub together, laying claim to a cabin that even coyotes avoided. She signed the deed with steady handwriting, rolled the paper up, and tucked it into her satchel. That evening she led her mule down the dirt road, the townsfolk watching as her figure grew small against the backdrop of mountains bleeding orange under the last of the sun. They shook their heads, muttered to each other, and swore they'd see her back in town by morning, frightened off by the first creak of those rotten boards. But Clara had lived long enough to know ghosts made better company than people. The cabin greeted her with silence. She pushed the door open, and the hinges shrieked like something alive. Dust rolled out in a pale wave. Inside, the air smelled of old ash and dry rot, but there was space, a hearth of stone, a single-room floor with gaps wide enough to peer through to the dirt beneath, and a loft above reachable by ladder. She set her lantern on the mantel and brushed her hand across the beam. Splinters bit her palm, sharp reminders that the wood still had teeth. She didn't mind. Wood could be mended. As night fell, she unpacked her few belongings: a quilt her mother had sewn when she was a girl, a skillet, a knife, and a Bible she hadn't opened in years. She spread her bedroll before the hearth, struck a match, and lit a small fire. The flames licked upward, chasing back the shadows that clung to the corners. For the first time since leaving Kansas, she let herself breathe deep. This was hers. The wind moaned low through the chinks in the wall, and somewhere upstairs a board groaned like a heavy footstep. Clara froze, every muscle tight. She listened. Just the settling of wood, she told herself. Just age and emptiness. She went back to her fire, but when she closed her eyes that night, sleep would not come. For in the silence between the crackle of flames, she swore she heard it. Breathing that was not her own. The fire snapped and hissed, sparks leaping into the air as though they too were uneasy in the cabin. Clara lay stiff beneath her quilt, staring into the shadows that gathered just beyond the flicker of her lantern. The sound of that breathing, it wasn't the wind, not unless the wind had lungs and a steady rhythm. Her hand crept toward the knife she kept tucked under her pillow. She gripped the hilt tight, waiting, ears straining. The minutes dragged on, marked only by the whistle of wind through the rafters. Slowly, her racing pulse steadied, and she told herself again it was nothing. Fear, after all, was a stubborn horse. It ran away with you if you didn't jerk the reins. She turned onto her side, facing the fire, and forced her eyelids down. But then came another sound, a thump overhead, in the loft, heavy, like a boot dropped on wood. Clara sat upright, knife in hand. The fire spat angrily as if in warning, casting her shadow long and thin across the wall. She rose without a sound, bare feet silent on the floorboards. Her lantern flame quivered as she lifted it high and turned toward the ladder leading up to the loft. "Who's there?" she called, her voice even but edged with steel. No reply, just silence so thick she could hear her own breath. She set one foot on the ladder, testing her weight. The wood creaked like an old man's bones. Another step, then another. The lantern light climbed with her, licking across the loft's edge. When her head rose above the floorboards, she froze. The loft was empty. Dust lay thick as snow, undisturbed save for one thing, the clear impression of a boot print, darker than the boards around it, as though pressed into the wood itself. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She swung the lantern wider. No boots, no body, just that single print pointed toward her like a warning. She climbed down slowly, heart thudding hard enough she feared it might rattle her ribs. Back on the ground, she shoved the ladder aside, letting it crash into the wall. If something wanted down, it would have to jump. The rest of the night stretched long. She sat awake before the fire, knife across her lap, lantern burning low. The breathing never returned, nor the footsteps. Only silence, pressing in from all sides, until the first gray fingers of dawn slipped through the cracks in the shutters. When morning came, Clara dragged the ladder back into place and climbed again. The boot print was gone. The boards looked the same as the rest, weathered, pale, and cracked. She pressed her hand to the spot, half expecting to feel heat, but it was cold as stone. She sat back on her heels, staring at the emptiness, then muttered under her breath, "I paid $50 for this place. Whatever haunts it, better learn I don't scare easy." Clara Hale was many things, but timid was not one of them. She had buried a husband, carried a child, only to lower him into the ground before he could walk, and crossed 2 states alone with nothing but a mule for company. If she could weather that, she told herself, she could weather an old cabin's tricks. Still, as the days passed, the unease clung to her like dust. The cabin made noises that had nothing to do with age, whispers in the timbers, taps along the windows when no wind stirred, the faint scrape of something moving across the floor at night. Once, while chopping wood outside, she glanced up and swore she saw a man's figure in the window watching her. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. But when she dropped her axe and stormed inside, the room was empty. By the end of her first week, Clara stopped mentioning the cabin at all when she rode into town for supplies. The townsfolk already looked at her sideways for taking the Miller place. No need to feed their gossip with talk of spirits, but whispers traveled fast in Dry Creek all the same. One evening, as she filled her sack with flour at the general store, the owner, Henry Collins, leaned across the counter. "You still keepin' out there?" Clara's jaw tightened. "I am?" He scratched at his whiskers, hesitating. "Ain't no business of mine, Miss Hale, but that place? Well, folks say Miller didn't die natural. Some say he shot hisself in that very loft." Clara met his eyes, steady as a gun sight. "If he did, then he's had plenty of time to make peace. And if he hasn't, he'll have to learn I don't rattle easy." Henry only shook his head, muttering as he wrapped her goods. But when Clara stepped back into the street, she caught 2 women across the way, whispering, their eyes darting toward her. She ignored them, loaded her sack onto the mule, and rode back toward her cabin. The desert stretched wide and endless, the sky painted with fire as the sun dipped low. But as she neared the cabin, she slowed her mule. Smoke curled from the chimney. Her chest went tight. She had left no fire burning. Knife in hand, she pushed the door open. The hearth glowed with fresh embers, warmth spilling into the room. And there, settled in her rocker by the fire, sat a shadow of a man. His hat brim hid his face, but his boots, mud-caked and worn, rested square on her floor. The same boots that had left their print in the loft. Clara didn't flinch. She set the lantern on the table slow and careful, the knife held low against her thigh. The mule snorted outside, hooves shifting, as if it too felt the room's altered air. The figure in the chair didn't move. The brim of his hat cut his face in half, a darkness deeper than the shadows around him. The heat of the hearth tugged at the hairs on Clara's arm, but a chill crept along her back like the touch of an unwelcome hand. "You're in my chair," she said, voice steady. The man tilted his head a fraction. The fire threw his boots in sharp relief, scarred leather, a long split down the right toe, dried mud clinging to the seams. A slow breath lifted the cloth at his chest. Clara's grip tightened. "You're trespassing," she added. "I don't take kindly to it." He spoke at last. His voice came dry as mesquite bark, the words scraped and low. "Ain't trespass if a man's sittin' where he was left." Clara stepped closer. "That's so." He nudged one heel against the floorboards. The wood gave a tired groan. "Paid hard coin for this piece of land. Pinned my hopes to it. Seems hopes don't hold the boards together like nails do. You're Miller." It wasn't a question. The brim dipped a hair, the closest thing to a nod. He tipped the hat up with 2 fingers. His face emerged, worn, gaunt, eyes like river stones left to bake in summer, something old and tired trapped behind them. Not the face of a fearsome outlaw, not even of a man who wanted to frighten her, just a man who'd been stretched too thin over too many years. "How long you been dead, Mr. Miller?" Clara asked, refusing to let the word catch. He considered the fire. "Long enough the grass that used to be knee-high out yonder is gone to dust, and long enough no one speaks my name lest they want to whisper it. You're sittin' in my house." He smiled, and it wasn't unkind. "I reckon it's mine, too." Clara's jaw set. "I bought it?" "From men who sold what wasn't theirs to keep," he said. "They sold the wood and the roof and the dirt, but they didn't sell the promises buried in 'em." She felt it then, the heavy sense in the room, like a prayer pressed into floorboards and stuffed into chinks with old mortar. She had slept on this ground one night, and already felt the shape of someone else's grief in it. Clara had known grief to be a stubborn animal. It stayed where you put it, and if you tried to move it, it bit. "What do you want?" she asked. He turned his head toward the loft. "There's a box up there. Left it where the board sings when you step. Couldn't bring myself to carry it out." He leaned forward, and the chair's long shadow lunged across the floor. "Fetch it, and I'll be on." Clara didn't break her stare. "I climbed that ladder last night. If there's a box, it wasn't keen to be seen. Boards and nails remember what a man forgets." He sank back. "You'll hear which one's hidin' it." She weighed his words, the knife heavy in her hand, the lantern flame whispering. Finally she moved to the ladder and set her foot to the first rung. It creaked low and mournful. She ascended slowly, each board complaining in its turn. At the top she crouched, lantern raised. The loft looked the same, empty, dust-furred. She laid her palm flat and crawled on her knees, feeling each plank. The wood under her hand was a map, rough seas of grain, ridges like dried rivers. Near the rear corner, a single board thrummed faintly under her weight, not a creak, a small, low hum, like a mouth against a jug. Clara set down the lantern and dug at the edge with the knife tip, easing the plank free. Beneath lay a hollow packed with old cloth and a small pine box the size of a Bible. She lifted it. The lid was tied with rawhide. She cut it and opened the box. Inside lay a tangle of things, a locket, a man's wedding ring on a leather thong, 3 letters folded to near disintegration, and a small pouch that clinked faintly with coin. There was a scrap of ribbon tied around one letter, blue gone gray with years. She did not read them. Those words belonged to someone else. She shut the lid, slid the board back into place, and descended. Miller hadn't moved. His eyes were on the hearth, but she could feel the tension in him loosen as she held out the box. "Couldn't take it with me," he said. "Couldn't leave it neither." "What's in these letters?" Clara asked. "Everything I should have said and not enough of it," he murmured. "She left before the winter set. I told her I'd follow after the thaw. Snow took the trail, took me too." "You ended yourself," Clara said, as flat as a ledger line. He didn't look at her. "A man can be ended without lifting a hand." Clara thought of a child's tiny grave in Kansas, a husband whose cough had chewed through him till there was nothing left but bone and apology, and the way the sky didn't darken or brighten any different when the ground swallowed a person you loved. "Sometimes," she agreed. Miller's gaze found hers then. "You going to keep this place?" "I paid for it," she said. "I came to put down roots." "You'll need water that doesn't go sour at first flood," he said. "And you'll need to set the door so it shuts true. Wind comes from the north and talks to a door that won't close." He studied her a long moment. "You got the look of someone who ain't running no more." "I ran out of road," she said. He nodded as if satisfied. His outline seemed to thin, like smoke gathering itself. "Put the box in the hearth when the fire's strong, not the coin. Give that to the first traveler who needs it more than you. The letters'll burn quick, the ring won't. Leave it. Its metal remembers." "You want me to burn what's left of you?" "I want you to settle what's owed." He tipped his hat. "I've been alone too long in a house that was supposed to be full." Clara's throat tightened. She looked down at the box, then back to the chair. It was empty. The rocker kept rocking for a few breaths more, then grew still. Outside, the mule brayed like it had seen a stranger step off the porch. The fire popped, a resin pocket giving way with a soft, sticky hiss. Clara stood alone with the box and the weight of another life in her hands. She had been alone so long she could tell the shape of it without looking. This absence felt different, like someone had left a chair and meant to come back, but had decided instead to let go. She placed the box on the mantel and stacked fresh kindling. When the flames leaped, she fed in the letters without looking at the words. Smoke curled in pale ribbons, sweet and bitter at once. The ribbon shriveled into black thread and vanished. The locket she set aside. It felt wrong to burn a face, even one she had never seen. The ring she held in her palm. It was scuffed and warm from the fire, too big for her finger, heavy in a way that didn't come from gold alone. She laid it on the mantel beside the locket, the coin pouch she tucked under the edge of the hearthstone. Then she sat and watched the flames eat the paper, and when the last edge crumbled, the cabin seemed to exhale. Sleep came to Clara without dreams that night. She woke with the sun and the feeling in her chest that something had shifted, like a sore tooth finally loosened enough to pull. She set to work. She patched every gap between the logs with moss and clay, mixed by hand till it was the texture of bread dough, and pressed it in with a spoon. She rehung the door, planed the edge, traded an afternoon's labor with old Ramon on the south side of town for iron hinges that didn't whine like a hungry cat. She dug at the old well, braced the rings, and cleared the choke of silt that had turned the water bitter. Clear water came up cold and clean, reflecting the piece of sky the cabin couldn't keep out. In the evening she walked the property line and memorized the land's moods, where wind gathered, where heat pooled, where rabbits cut their tracks through the scrub. Days folded into one another, long and bright. Nights came cooler. The presence in the cabin no longer pressed at her shoulder, but sometimes she heard a soft shift of wood, as if the house itself were settling into new hands. She began to talk to it without thinking. "Hold there," when she hammered. "Hush now," when the door caught. "Good," when a knot of stubborn pitch finally gave up. On the second week a rider came. He was young, 20s, if that, dust-caked from hat to boots, eyes red around the edges the way a man looks when he hasn't slept in a day and a night. He had a neat hole through his sleeve and a red stain beneath it, dried to brown. Clara stepped onto the porch with her rifle leaned casual against the doorframe. The rider tugged his reins. breathless horse skittering at the edge of her little yard. "You Clara Hale?" he asked. "I am?" He swallowed. "Name's Jonah Pike. Sheriff says you got a good head and a steadier hand than most. He said if I made it this far, I should ask you to—" He swayed in the saddle. Clara was at his side in 2 steps, catching the reins and pushing her shoulder under his weight as he slipped. "Easy now," she said. "Get your foot out of that stirrup. You fall wrong, you're going to drag." He blinked, obeyed, and half fell, half climbed down. She hooked an arm around his waist and guided him inside, set him in the chair by the fire, and cut the sleeve away. The wound was clean, through and through, but had festered from being wrapped with a dirty bandana. She boiled water, ground willow bark, cleaned the hole, and stitched him neat with the same care she used to close torn feed sacks. He hissed once through his teeth, and otherwise kept quiet, watching her face like he was reading a map. "That sheriff owes me a favor," Clara said when she finished. "He owes a lot of folks," Jonah muttered, and then he laughed and went near faint with the effort. Clara eased him back and put a cool cloth to his forehead. "Why'd he send you to me?" Jonah's eyes flicked to the mantle, to the ring and the locket. "Says you're not the spookable sort." "Did he also say I prefer folks to stand on their own feet while they bleed on my floor?" "Beggin' pardon, ma'am. I bled mostly outside." "What happened?" "Stage was hit north of Antelope Wash. 2 men down. Driver took one to the shoulder. They weren't after the mail. They were looking for a particular pouch." He grimaced. "Didn't find it. I took the leather case when they started shooting and lit out. Been riding hard ever since." "And the sheriff?" "Riding with a posse west. Told me to take the case to Dry Creek and give it to Henry Collins. Told me if I saw your chimney smoking, to stop and ask you to stitch me so I didn't leave a trail of myself along the road." Clara studied him. His hands weren't soft. Dirt had a way of wearing itself into a person's fingerprints, and his had ridges of it. The case he mentioned was wrapped in oilskin and strapped tight to his belt. She didn't ask to see it. Not yet. "You can sleep on the floor," she said. "I got no bed to share and no taste for explaining otherwise." He flushed, then paled and nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She set a pallet by the hearth, brewed tea, and ignored his curious glances at the ring and locket on the mantel. When he finally dozed, she sat at the table, laid out the leather case, and placed one finger on it. She didn't open it. A person's secrets weren't hers to handle, and besides, she knew what trouble smelled like: copper and old coin and the acrid edge of fear. This case held all 3. Near midnight, the door rattled softly on its hinges. No wind moved outside. The mule brayed once and fell silent, not alarmed, merely answering his own kind of question. Clara reached for her rifle and slid it close. A whisper moved along the wall, the suggestion of a man's weight passing by. It slowed where Miller's chair stood and then stopped by the table. The air cooled as if a cloud had passed over the fire. Clara did not turn her head. She could see the edge of the table, her hands, the knuckles pale where she held tight. "You told me to give coin to the first traveler needs it more than me," she said into the quiet. "He's here. He bled in my chair. He's carrying a thing that'll bring men to my door with less forgiveness than coyotes." The quiet breathed back. It felt like agreement. She reached into the hearth shadow and pulled the little coin pouch. Jonah muttered, turned over, and kept sleeping as she set the pouch on the table. She left it there until dawn. When Jonah woke, he found it beside the tea, $5 in coin, more than a month's wages for some men. "That yours?" he asked, unfastening the bandage to check the wound like a man who'd been taught to mind his own flesh. "No," Clara said. "Belonged to the man who built this house. He told me to pass it on." Jonah's brow knit in confusion. "He told you?" "He did." "You mean in a letter?" He looked at the mantle again, at the ring and locket. "Or you mean it like folks mean it when they talk about old houses in the dark?" Clara poured tea. "I mean the way I mean it." He stared another beat, then let it go. "I can't take this." You can and you will, she said. You got a ride to finish, and I doubt you've got coin for a fresh horse in town. He started to protest again, saw her face, and thought better of it. He tucked the pouch into his vest like he was putting away something brittle and dear. He touched the locket's edge with his eyes again, without actually laying a finger on it. You married Miss Hale? I was. Sorry. So am I. He nodded. Stage'll be early at Collins's if it runs at all. I best get moving. Clara walked him out, checked his cinch, and slapped the horse's flank. He rode off with the road dust climbing his back like a second shadow. She stood a while after the sound of hooves faded, the morning sun laying gold across the scrub. The ring glinted in the corner of her eye. She turned back inside, held it in her palm, and considered. Miller had asked her to leave it on the mantel, but promises had a way of turning into anchors if you didn't use them right. She threaded a leather thong through the ring and looped it over a nail by the door. It swung there, eye bright as a coin in the dark, and settled. You watch the door, she told it without smiling. I'll watch the yard. Toward noon, a dust plume rose from the south. 2 riders. No hurry in their pace. Purpose, but not panic. Clara's hands found careful places to rest. She didn't reach for the rifle. She set the kettle on instead. When the riders came into the yard and swung down, she had 2 cups ready. They were rangers. No badges pinned, but the posture gave it away. And the eyes. Men who knew what the land could hide and what it could uncover, given a gentle prod. The older one took off his hat. Afternoon, ma'am. Afternoon. We're hunting a runner, he said. Young fella carried a case off a stage. Might be wounded. Might be green around the gills. You missed him by half a day, Clara said. He slept on that pallet and bled on that rag. He didn't open the case, and neither did I. The younger ranger squinted, measuring. You sure about that? I'm sure what my hands didn't do. The older ranger gave the smaller nod men use when an answer fits into a pocket they can use later. He headed to Dry Creek? He did. Much obliged. He set his cup down and glanced at the mantel. His eyes snagged on the ring. That a Miller ring? Could be. You bought this place? I did. He studied the door's clean swing, the fresh mortar in the chinks, the smell of a house that had been empty of laughter and now held the echo of a new voice. You hear anything out here at night? He asked, like a man asking if the wind still ran alongside the train. I hear what the place says. Clara met his eyes. It don't lie. The younger ranger gave a small half-chuckle and shook his head. The older one lifted his hat, polite as a prayer, and the 2 of them mounted up and rode out. That afternoon, someone knocked on the door who did not wish to be announced. Knuckles rapped soft. A shadow shifted behind the fabric of the window. Clara stepped into the gap between table and stove, a place where a bullet might not find her straight away. She leaned her hip back against the counter and called, "Door's open!" It swung inward. The man who entered wore trail dust like a coat and had a scar from ear to collarbone that looked like lightning had tried to write on his neck and failed. Another man ghosted behind him, thinner, eyes jittering. You Clara Hale? The scarred man asked. Seems everyone's asking me that today. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. We're looking for a case hand-sewn oilskin. Young rider took it. Might have bled on your floor. The rangers just came through, Clara said. They aimed to find that same case. You look to be stepping in a dance already full. He took 2 steps into the room, slow and admiring. His gaze found the ring on the nail. He tipped his head a fraction. You believe in talismans, Miss Hale? I believe in doors that shut and rifles that shoot true. The thin man tittered, nerves spilling out of him like marbles. The scarred man laid a hand flat on the table, drummed his fingers once. Funny thing about houses out here. They look small from the outside. Inside, they can hold more stories than a courthouse. Some of us don't like to hear ourselves talk so much, Clara said. He grinned again. Then I'll be plain. He came here. He left. You had eyes on him. You'll tell me where. I already did. He went to Dry Creek. The thin man's eyes ticked to the locket. You married? He asked. parroting Jonah's earlier question like it was a useful piece of gossip and not a wound. "Was," Clara said. "Where's the man?" "Under Kansas." Scarface made a sympathetic noise that didn't match his mouth. "Life's hard, and even harder when men make it so." "Truth," Clara said. "I find it gets harder still when men bring their trouble to my door." He tapped the table again. His hand slid a few inches and stopped by the leather case's outline, burned into the wood in his imagination. "You didn't see him open it?" "No, he didn't have that kind of foolishness." "You a helpful type, Miss Hale?" "Sometimes," she said. "Mostly I'm particular." "I'd be beholden if you got particular in a way that profits me." "And I'd be beholden if you turned around and walked out." The thin one bristled. The scarred man lifted a calming hand. The gesture so controlled Clara knew he was the only dangerous one between them. "We'll go," he said, "seeing as how we got business in town. Before we do, I'm going to tell you a story." "I don't favor stories," Clara said. "I favor results." "You'll like this one." He leaned on his knuckles, face close enough that she could smell the dust in his breath. "A man named Miller got himself into business he couldn't finish. Carried a ring on his finger that wasn't paid for yet. Carried a debt. He tried to settle it with his life. Thing about debts, Miss Hale, is they don't end, they turn. They go find new hands to sit on." Clara felt the skin at her neck prickle. She did not look at the ring on the nail. "I don't carry other people's notes." "World thinks otherwise." He straightened. "Pleasure." He turned, and both men left as quietly as they had arrived. Her hand shook for the first time since she'd set foot in Dry Creek. She set water to boil, not because she needed tea, but because she needed the sound of something steady. The house watched her, the way a canyon watches a rider, not with malice or with kindness, but because it has the time to do so. "Miller," she said into the room, not needing to raise her voice, "if you got a debt, I won't carry it. If you got a promise, I'll keep it. Those are two different beasts." The door creaked slightly as if someone leaned a shoulder to it in assent. The ring on its thong swayed once, a small circle that grew smaller until it went still. Sunset brought a silence that felt less empty and more like a held breath. Clara saddled the mule and rode into town under a sky cut with pink. At Collins's, the lamps burned low. The sign clacked against its hook in the wind. Inside, Henry stood behind the counter with his sleeves rolled and his eyes red. Jonah sat on a barrel near the flour sacks, his arm bound fresh in clean linen, the leather case no longer at his belt. "Sheriff came," Henry said. "Took the pouch. Said hell's loose up the pass. Said if you'd seen any strangers." "Two men," Clara said. "One wore a scar like he'd argued with a lightning bolt and lost. The other looked like somebody had shaken him and forgot to stop." "That'd be Finch," Jonah said grimly. "The jittery one. The scarred man. Some call him Bishop. He don't pray, but he sure knows how to lay hands." "They asked about Miller," Clara said evenly. Henry's jaw worked. "Figures. Folks still talk about Miller like his bones can reach from the dirt. He went over to the bank for a loan years back. Paid a part. Rest was supposed to come when the well gave sweet, and when the small herd he had dropped calves. Winter took the calves. The well went sour. He never got square with the bank. Then he was gone." "Who holds the notes now?" Clara asked. "Bank changed hands twice. Last set of paper ended up with a man named Ira Keats. Guess who rode in 2 days ago looking to call debts? Old as ghost stories." "Bishop," Clara said. Henry nodded. "He's got a mean way of making old promises feel fresh." "Sheriff's after him?" "The sheriff's after the men who shot up the stage. Bishop's a clever one. He's got others do the dirty and keeps his hands smelling of soap. Then he came to my door to make me a part of his soap," Clara said. Jonah stood, swaying a bit. "You shouldn't be out there alone, Miss Hale, not while this wind is up." "I've been alone a good long while," she said. "I'm practiced." "He means it," Henry added. "Bishop's the kind of storm that looks small on the horizon and then eats your house. If he says Miller's debt sticks to the timbers, he'll stand on that like it's a pulpit." Let him talk, Clara said. I don't owe a man coin for breathing air someone else breathed first. Henry pushed a wrapped parcel across the counter. You ordered nails. Take 'em. And take this, too. He slid a small tin. Gun grease. Keep the bolt from stickin'. Clara met his eyes. You're a practical man, Henry. Practicality is the last refuge of cowards and the first of survivors, he said with weary humor. I aim for the second. She left as the sky turned from pink to plum, and the first star pricked a bright hole in the dark. The road home felt narrower. When she reached the cabin, she circled once, listening. No voices, no horses. Her mule sighed as if to say finally, and nosed the trough. Inside, the air smelled of ash and iron, tea and wild sage she'd hung to dry. She closed the door, set the iron bar, checked the rifle, and sat. The rocker moved once, a soft motion, then settled. It felt like an old man lifting his hat in greeting. Bishop says you owed him, Clara told the room. The ring on the thong did not move. The fire made a small throat-clearing sound, then caught on fresh wood and brightened. You left a ring and a locket, she said. You left letters. I settled what I could. What's left ain't mine to settle. A coyote cried in the distance, high and lonely. Clara slept with her back to the wall and her rifle across her knees. At some hour past midnight, when stars drew nearest and the desert's breath went cold, the floor shivered under a boot step. Not the loft this time, the porch boards, a soft weight, then another, then silence. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The door eased against its latch, the way a careful hand tests a dog's bite. The iron bar held. The pressure withdrew, a minute, then 5. Then a whisper, not in the wood, but from a human mouth. The soft drag of a palm across the door like a man thinking about what lay between his hand and his desire. Go home, Clara said into the dark. You'll leave with less than you came. The whisper cut. Footsteps ghosted off the porch. A horse snorted. Hooves turned in dirt that never bothered to keep secrets for long. In the morning she found a mark on the door, a shallow scratch the shape of a cross laid on its side. A sign or a habit or a man's way of telling himself he was in control when he was only looking for it. Clara brushed her fingertip across it and felt nothing but wood. She thought of Jonah's thin face and the coin pouch, of the ranger's eyes, of Bishop's smile, of Miller's chair. She rode the fence line. She set small bells along the back where mesquite crowded close, bells she'd been saving from her child's trunk, a sound meant for a different kind of waking. She strung wire at calf height across a narrow pass that men on fast horses might take. She dug a shallow pit near the porch and laid thin saplings over it, covered with sand, a lesson she'd learned mending corrals. You didn't need a man to break his leg. You only needed to slow him long enough to decide if you were going to send him away or put him under. When the sun was straight overhead, she heard the first bell, a single chime, delicate, almost apologetic, then another. Someone moving along the back brush, slow. She set her rifle to her shoulder and moved through the house to the rear window. A shadow slid between creosote and yucca. Not Bishop, too slight. The shadow paused, a hand lifted, palm out, empty. A woman's voice drifted low. Don't shoot. Clara didn't lower the gun. You're trespassing. I know. The woman stepped into full view. She wore a man's coat too big for her and had a face that had seen as much sun as it could stand. Her eyes were pale and tired. I came to ask for something that's not mine. Most folks do. Ira Keats holds paper on this place, the woman said. He sent men to collect, men like Bishop. Keats owns the bank, Clara said. He owns more than that, the woman whispered. He owns my boy. He took him on a writ for a debt my husband owed before the fever took him. Said the boy could work it off in 6 months. It's been a year. Bishop collects men like he collects coin. What's that to me? Folks say you got a ghost that talks. I figured if any house knew how to set the dead down, it'd be yours. She swallowed. Keats keeps papers in a safe in the back of the bank. Bishop's after one writ in particular tied to this land. If that paper burns, your cabin's yours for as long as your spine holds. If other papers burn, my boy might be more than a shadow in a man's ledger. You come to ask me to rob a bank, Clara said. I came to ask if you know how to unmake a promise that never should have been written. Clara let the rifle ease a fraction from her shoulder. What's your name? Ruth Miller, the woman said softly, and the world narrowed to the space between the heartbeat and the echo. He was my kin. Clara studied her face, and in the tilt of her mouth, in the set of her eyes, she saw a ghost that wasn't the kind that hid in chairs or spoke through floorboards. This ghost wore breath and bone. You're kin to the man who died here. He was my brother, Ruth whispered. He had a wife who left and a son who didn't. The boy ran to the mountains when the law came. Keats wrote papers to make grief look tidy. We ain't been tidy since. Clara set the rifle down. Come inside. Ruth took 3 careful steps forward and crossed the threshold like a woman stepping into a church with a heart full of wrong things. Her eyes fell on the ring and the locket. She put her hand to her mouth, not to weep, but to hold something in place that might otherwise fall. He told me to burn the letters, Clara said. He told me to leave the ring. Ruth nodded, jaw trembling, and said all at once. He was a man who loved ideals more than he loved himself. It didn't keep him warm. Sit, Clara said. Tell me what you know about Keats and about Bishop. Tell me what the sheriff won't speak aloud. Ruth spoke, and as she did, the house listened, the way a canyon does. And a woman with red clay hair and desert hawk eyes arranged the pieces in her mind like kindling. If debts were stories written by men who liked their names on paper, then maybe a woman could write something else and set the paper alight so that only the true part remained, the part that said a place belonged to the person who could protect it, who could keep water sweet and doors shut and promises placed where they could be kept. When Ruth finished, Clara stood, walked to the mantel, and took down the ring. She slid it into her pocket, heavy as the choice she'd already made. Let's go see if a ghost and 2 women can make tidy what never should have been messy, she said. Ruth stared at her. You're serious. I'm alive, Clara said. That's better. They rode at dusk, when the town's edges blurred and men's eyes were on their supper. The bells at Clara's fence chimed once, as if to bless them or warn them, and the mule set his ears forward like he was listening hard. The sky went from gold to blue to a bruised purple that said the day would give them a little extra grace if they asked. Dry Creek's bank sat like a tooth at the center of town, whitewashed and pretending to be cleaner than the hands that counted its coin. The alley ran narrow behind it. Ruth led Clara through shadows that held the smell of horses and beer, and somebody's old sins dried into boards. The back door had a simple lock. Simple locks are for honest men. Clara wasn't sure what that made her. She took a sliver of iron from her pocket, remembered the way hinges talk to people who listen, and coaxed the lock's tongue to slip. Inside smelled of ledger ink and varnish. The safe sat behind a desk, squat and smug. Clara knelt. You religious? She asked Ruth. I talk to the sky sometimes, Ruth said. Talk to it now, Clara murmured, laying her ear to the metal. Safe's breath in clicks when you move their dials, and all you have to do is hear the difference between a lie and a truth. She spun, listened, spun, listened. A click that sounded like a pebble dropped in a dry well, another that sounded like a boot heel on soft wood, the third sounded like a man sighing when he finally sat down. She pulled. The handle gave. The door yawed open with the quiet of a man admitting defeat. Paper lived inside, stacks of it, banded and glued. Promises and prisons written in tidy hands. Clara's palm hovered over the sheaf of debt notes like a dowser over dirt. Miller, Ira Keats's neat script said, and below it a string of numbers with a little whip of a flourish. Ruth's breath hitched, Another folder, worker's indenture, Joshua Miller. There were a dozen more. Jonah Pike, a woman named Ada Reeves, a man called Finch. Clara's lip twitched. She slid his note free. She slid Jonah's too. She slid Ruth's boys. She slid Miller's. She slid hers. The cabin, the land, the well. Paper that hadn't yet been written but had been promised to be when Keats got around to it. The blank was already there, Keats's signature like a mouth ready to eat. Ruth touched the paper like it might burn her. What do we do? Make a choice, Clara said. The old one or the new? She folded the notes and shoved them into the leather case Jonah had carried, there on the desk from earlier, like the desert had decided to set out props for a play it wanted to see performed right. She shut the safe. She took Keats's seal from the drawer, pressed it into the soft wax by habit, not reason, and put it back where it belonged. They were almost to the door when a voice slid across the room like oil on tile. You took your time. Bishop stepped from the dark, hands easy, face bright, like a man congratulating children for an attempt he planned to correct. Two others flanked him, silhouettes with breath and not much else. Good evening, Clara said, and she meant it. Evenin', Bishop replied. Ira says if anyone gets bold, they get lost before they find the back door. Seems you ladies found it right quick. Seems doors prefer honest hands, Clara said, or stubborn ones. He nodded toward the case. That's mine. It's not, Clara said. That's the thing about paper. It's only yours if everyone agrees to the lie. Then we're at the point where we make the lie true. His voice sharpened. The two shapes shifted, hands near metal. Clara took one step forward. She put the case on the desk and laid her hand on it like a preacher's on a Bible. You know what happens if you shoot in here? She asked. Town hears. Sheriff comes. He may be beholden to men with coin, but he doesn't like being woken from supper. And I hear tell the Rangers have a taste for closing accounts that bleed. Bishop smiled. You're smarter than you look, Miss Hale. That's a compliment. Now slide that across. Clara glanced at Ruth. Ruth's jaw set. The house back on the edge of the desert seemed to press into Clara's spine, the way a hand might if you were about to step off a rock into a river that would be cold at first and then fine. She picked up her lantern, which she had set on the desk. She tilted it. Oil-kissed wick. Flame leaped. She held the case's corner to it. The leather blackened, then caught. Slow and stubborn. Ruth gasped. Bishop's smile faltered. Stop, he said, laughter trimmed short. Clara blew out the lantern and tossed it aside. She cradled the case like a loaf of bread and tipped it so the burning edge could bite deeper. The room filled with the smell of singed hide and something else, the sweet stink of old ink, setting loose everything it had been holding back. Bishop took one step. Her rifle came up clean and steady and pointed at the space between his buttons. Don't, she said. We both know I'll do it. They held there, the three of them, the kind of moment that makes time give up and sit down. Then Bishop did a thing that told Clara more about him than all his talk. He stepped back. You burn those, and there'll be men in this town have no reason to fear me. Maybe they had no reason to start, Clara said. The case burned through, the flap falling open to let out a rush of smoke and embers. Paper inside flared. Ruth whispered something that might have been a prayer and might have been a curse. Clara watched the edges curl. When the last sheet blackened, she set the case down, stomped the embers under her boot, and let silence come back to the room, full and sudden. Bishop stared at the little pile of ash. He lifted his eyes slowly to Clara's face. She saw now what kept men like him walking into rooms like this. Belief. Not in God, not in country, in himself. He believed he had the right to rearrange other people's lives with his hands because he'd done it often enough and hadn't yet been made to stop. Ira won't like this, he said. Ira can learn, Clara said. Bishop's mouth twitched. You're right. Shooting in here would be noisy. It would make the wrong kind of story. But you and me, Miss Hale, will meet again where the floorboards carry our footsteps into the ground and keep them. Maybe, Clara said. He tipped his hat like a gentleman at a wedding. Then he and his shadows slid back into the dark and left the scent of gun oil and plans behind them. Ruth sagged against the wall, shaking. What have we done? Paid off a debt with fire, Clara said. It's the only coin that spends everywhere. They walked out the back, the alley cooler, the stars sharper. A dog barked 2 streets over and then remembered it was night and quieted. Ruth touched Clara's arm. Come to supper, Ruth said softly, as if something of the old world still needed asking. I make stew with more patience than spice. Tomorrow, Clara said. Tonight I should be where I can hear the bells. Ruth nodded. I'll send my boy tomorrow to thank you himself. Tell him to bring nails, Clara said. I always need more nails. They parted at the end of the alley. Clara rode home through a town that felt like it had let something out of its lungs. The cabin's shape rose from the earth as if it had been there all along, waiting for the world to catch up with it. The ring by the door glinted in the lantern light as she pushed inside. The rocker creaked once. It's done, she told the house, or it started. The fire took on for her like an old friend. She sat in the chair opposite the empty one and watched heat draw lines across the wood, faint as letters addressed to someone who'd moved and left no forwarding place but this. A slow breath moved somewhere that wasn't the wind, not a threat, a thanks. The kind of thanks a man gives not with words, but with absence, with the promise to stop haunting the living the way grief tries to. Clara slept heavy and woke early. She set bread in the coals. She hung her wash. She checked the bells. She thought of Bishop, of the look in his eye, when a woman with a rifle and a burning case had rewritten his day. She thought of what kind of man comes back after that, the kind that believes he is owed, the kind that doesn't learn. She had known one of those. The fever had taken him. This kind wore a hat that hadn't been in a sick room in 20 years. Closer to noon, hoofbeats. Ruth's boy rode in, thin as a fence rail, hair like a crow's wing. He slid off his pony and stood awkward in the yard. "Ma'am," he said, holding out a sack. "Nails." "Much obliged," Clara said. "Hungry?" He nodded in a way that wasn't a nod and wasn't anything else. She set a bowl in his hands and watched him eat, quick and careful. When he finished, he looked at the ring. He looked at her. "Ma says you talk to ghosts." "I listen to houses," Clara said. "She says you ain't afraid." Clara considered. "I'm afraid of the wrong things," she said. "Makes me steady when it counts." He grinned without meaning to, and for a heartbeat she saw a child with dirt on his face and joy like a bird in his chest. Then the world put its weight back on him, and he bowed his head. "Ma says you saved my name from being ink. I didn't ask to be ink." "No one does," Clara said. "Your breath and work in a back that'll ache before it should. Keep your feet under you and your voice where you can find it." "I can work," he said, earnest and immediate. The way boys are when they try to prove they're the kind of men they've had to be too soon. "You just did," she said, lifting the sack of nails. "Come back when the sun's lower. Bring a hammer. I'll show you where the boards still lie." He mounted, tipped his hat like he'd seen men do and was practicing, and rode off. Around that time the sky changed. Clouds gathered from the north, not rain clouds, but the kind that make a horizon feel closer. The bells on the back line chimed once, then twice, as if the wind had found them and wanted to warm its fingers. Clara wiped her hands and went to the door. Bishop sat his horse at the edge of her yard, just outside the drift of her dust. He had 2 men with him and something new on his face, a kind of politeness that was worse than a drawn gun. "Afternoon," he called. "Afternoon," she returned. "Ira Keats would like to speak with you." "You can tell him to write," Clara said. "I'd rather deliver the invitation in person," Bishop said. "Saves paper and fire." Clara stepped to the yard's edge, her boots making small sighs in the sand. "You think you frighten me." "I know I don't," he said, almost kindly. "But you and me, Miss Hale, We're in the part of the story where the town decides what kind it is, and towns take their cues from the people stubborn enough to stand in front of them and refuse to budge. I admire it. I make a living breaking it. Here's a thought, Clara said. Change your living. He laughed, head thrown back, teeth bright. I used to be poor, now I'm useful. Men like Keats always need a man like me. Then you work for men who can't do their own work, she said. I work for a house. It's a better boss. He slid off his horse. His boots made no sound at all. Men like that learn or they die. Last time I was here, you set something right with fire. This time, I came to set something right with the law. Whose? He smiled again. The one written by men with pens and coin. The only one that counts the way counting gets done. Ira says you sit in a house that owes. He says the deed you signed is smoke if the past says so. He says he can put you out if you don't come in. You practice your speech? Clara asked. He didn't answer. He lifted a paper stamped the color of old blood. Subpoena, he said, savoring the word. Clara thought of the case, of the way smoke had turned clean as it left the paper, of the faces for whom breath had suddenly become easier. She thought of Ruth, of Jonah, of Henry, and his practical cowardice and his practical courage. She thought of Miller's chair and the ring on the nail. Bring it here, she said. He walked forward. The other two came too, hands a little lower, eyes hungry. Bishop stopped at the porch because he had a sense for thresholds and what crosses them. He held out the paper. Clara took it. It was thick, inked with a hand that wanted to be art. Keats's name glared up like a pond in sun. Her own name below it, Clara Hale, in a script she did not own. Town Hall, Bishop said softly. Tonight. I'll be there, she said. I'll be there too, he said. Ira likes a show. I like results, she said. They looked at each other, and for a moment they were just two people made of bone and choice, and then the world remembered itself and gave them back their parts. He mounted. He tugged his horse's head and turned away. As he did, the bells at the back line chimed 3 times, a breeze that wasn't a breeze. Bishop didn't look. Men who believe they own the wind don't notice when it tries to say their names. Clara stood at the porch's edge, the paper in her hand. She went inside, set it on the table, and put the ring down on top of it. A circle over a name. She never prayed to anything that needed an altar, but she did talk to houses. And this one had a voice now, hers, and the man who had sat in the rocker, and the boy who would hammer crooked nails straight with her that evening. Town Hall, she said to the empty chair. You coming? The rocker gave a small creak, the kind an old friend might make when he shifts his weight and smiles without showing his teeth. Clara put on her coat, slipped the ring into her pocket, loaded her rifle, and stepped into the afternoon that felt like a held note waiting for the next chord. The town hall of Dry Creek was a squat building of pine beams, its windows dusty, its bell rusted on the roof, though no hand had rung it in years. That evening, the benches filled quick, ranchers with calloused hands, wives clutching shawls, miners leaning on crutches, even children perched wide-eyed in the back. The air carried the hot tang of kerosene lamps and the thicker scent of suspicion. Ira Keats sat near the front, spectacles gleaming, papers stacked in neat piles before him like a general with his orders spread on a map. Beside him, Bishop lounged with one boot hooked on the rung of his chair, his scar glinting in the lamplight. His eyes found Clara as she entered, slow and deliberate, rifle in hand but muzzle down, and his grin came like the cut of a knife. The sheriff cleared his throat, but his voice barely carried. We're gathered to hear Mr. Keats's claim upon the Hale cabin, known before as the Miller place. Keats stood, smoothing his vest. Ladies and gentlemen, I hold papers, lawful papers, that say the Miller property was never rightly settled. Debts unpaid, promises broken. That cabin belongs by law to the bank. He lifted one sheet, ink sharp and black. This writ bears my seal. It names Miss Clara Hale as tenant of a property that cannot be hers. I call on this town to enforce what is just." Murmurs rippled. Some nodded. Others frowned. Clara stepped forward until the lamplight caught the red in her hair. She set the subpoena on the table and laid the ring on top, metal flashing like an eye in the dark. "This paper says I don't belong," she said, her voice even. "This ring says otherwise. A man died in that cabin. He left debts, maybe. He left grief, surely. He left his name pressed into the boards so deep the wind still speaks it. I bought that place. I patched its walls. I drew clean water when the well tried to sour. I buried the ghosts proper. That's more right than ink." Bishop chuckled. "Ink outlasts ghosts, Miss Hale." Clara's eyes cut to him. "Not when the ghosts have friends." The room shifted. People straightened, leaned forward, waited. Ruth Miller rose from the back, her face pale but her eyes fierce. She held up a bundle of charred leather, the remains of the case Clara had burned. "Ira Keats writes debts," she said, "but debts burn. I saw it done." The sheriff's brow furrowed. "What's she mean?" Jonah Pike pushed himself up on his bandaged arm. "Means Bishop's men shot up a stagecoach for those papers. Means Clara Hale kept them from putting our names in chains. I carried that case, and I saw it turn to ash. You want law? The fire settled it." A low thunder of voices rose, the kind of sound that comes when a crowd begins to tilt one way. Keats slammed his palm on the table. "That's arson! That's theft!" Clara stepped closer, her shadow long against the wall. "It's freedom. Paper can lie. Work doesn't. This town knows who hauls water, who stitches wounds, who stands when the door rattles at midnight. Tell me, Mr. Keats, when's the last time your hands blistered for Dry Creek?" Bishop's smile faltered. Keats's face flushed dark. The sheriff looked to the benches, saw more nods than frowns, and his shoulders squared. "I reckon," he said slowly, "that a deed written in ash and sweat holds truer than one written in ink and trickery." The room broke, not into cheers, but into the low murmur of assent that runs like a current, steady and unstoppable. Clara lifted the ring, slid it back on the nail string, and tied it to her belt. "This place is mine," she said. "Not because Keats allows it, not because Bishop threatens it, but because I'll keep it safe, for myself, for anyone who knocks needing a hand instead of a fist." For a long beat, no one moved. Then Ruth crossed the floor and stood beside her. Jonah followed, pale but upright. One by one, others rose until Keats sat alone at his neat table, his papers worthless as dust. Bishop stood slow, his chair scraping like a blade. His grin was gone. "This ain't the last chapter, Miss Hale." Clara met his gaze without blinking. "Then you'd best pray the story's kinder to you than the town will be." The rocker creaked in her mind then, soft and certain, as if the ghost of the cabin itself had leaned forward to listen. ChatGPT said, "The air in the hall seemed to freeze when Bishop spoke. His shadow stretched long in the lamplight, jagged across the pine boards like something torn from the earth. For a heartbeat, no one dared breathe. The silence so taut Clara could hear the scrape of her own pulse in her ears. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. "You'll find I'm not much for chapters," Clara said evenly. "I write endings." A ripple went through the benches, half a gasp, half a murmur of approval. Bishop's grin twisted, but his eyes stayed cold. He tipped his hat to her as though she were a dance partner he'd not yet chosen to spin, then turned for the door. His two shadows followed, boots heavy on the boards. Ira Keats fumbled with his papers, his lips pressed white. "This isn't law," he sputtered. "This is mob rule." The sheriff leaned his weight on the table, his jaw set like stone. "It's Dry Creek's rule, and that's what matters here." Keats gathered his papers in shaking hands, but they no longer carried the weight he wanted them to. The crowd's eyes no longer measured ink. They measured work, sweat, blood, the kind of currency no bank ledger could hold. Clara stood until the last murmur faded. When she finally turned to leave, Ruth Miller was at her side, Jonah Pike just behind her, his bandaged arm resting against his chest like a badge of survival. The townsfolk parted to let them pass, and in their faces Clara read something she hadn't seen in years: trust. Outside, the night air was sharp with sage. The stars burned like iron filings spilled across black velvet. Clara drew a slow breath, the kind of breath you take when a storm has passed, but the clouds still hover on the horizon. Bishop would be back. She knew it as sure as she knew the weight of her rifle. Men like him didn't vanish. They circled until the next chance came. Back at the cabin, the mule brayed low, ears flicking at shadows only animals seemed to see. Clara unslung her rifle and swept the yard with her eyes, steady, unhurried. The bells she'd strung along the back fence gave no cry. The night was still. She stepped onto the porch and paused. The rocker moved once, creaking like an old friend clearing his throat. She set the ring back on the nail above the door, touched it with 2 fingers, and whispered, "It's ours now." The house seemed to settle around her, wood sighing, fire popping low in the hearth. For the first time since she'd laid her bedroll on those dusty boards, Clara Hale felt not like a trespasser, but like someone who had come home. But the West was never done testing a person, and Clara knew, out here, peace was only ever the breath you drew before the next fight. The first sign was the hawk. It wheeled over the flats at dawn, riding a seam of rising air that the sun stitched up out of the cold. Clara stood by the well, rope burning her palms as she hauled. She watched the bird cut a tight circle, tilt, and fix on the valley mouth where the road curled between 2 shoulders of stone. She knew then, before the mule flicked an ear, before the bells breathed their thin chime, that the day had made up its mind. She set the bucket, drank deep, and poured the rest into the trough. Then she went inside and laid her hand against the door, fingers spread, as if feeling the heartbeat of a sleeping thing. "I hear you," she said. "I'll brace." She set to it with a calm that was almost gentle, rifles oiled, cylinder spun, cartridges counted, and slipped into a tin. She checked the line she'd strung along the mesquite draw, the pit by the porch, the simple snares that wouldn't maim a man so much as humble him. She dragged a stack of cordwood into the yard, cover if she needed it, and filled a lamp with fresh oil, then set it in the window where it could throw a man's shadow long and wrong. By the time the sun cleared the rim of the hills, Ruth Miller's boy came loping up the path, breathless, hat clamped to his head, as if the wind might otherwise lift him off the earth. "Bishop," he gasped. He rode through town at first light. 2 wagons, 4 men on horses. Ira Keats with 'em, but he looked sick about it. "Folks doing anything foolish?" Clara asked. "Sheriff's gathering a few to watch from the ridge, just to show Bishop he's not walking in on a ghost town. Jonah's there. Ruth told me to keep my bones out of it." He scuffed the toe of his boot. "I ain't real good at that." "You did right coming here first," Clara said. She handed him a canteen and a heel of bread. "You go back and stick to your ma. If it turns loud, you keep her head low. That's the work you got right now." He nodded, cheeks dark with shame and relief, swallowed both down with water, and ran. Clara stood in the doorway a while, listening. The desert had a way of telling stories out loud if you kept your teeth together and let the sound of your own thoughts die off. Bees worrying at the sage. A lizard scratching under the porch somewhere far. The faint clop and jingle of a traveling set that knew it was being listened to and stretched the waiting out like a piece of rawhide. She took the ring down from the nail and put it on its thong around her neck. It settled against her sternum with the soft clink of a coin in a pocket. She slid the locket, the one she hadn't burned, into her dress, over her heart. "I won't carry a debt," she said to the empty rocker. "Just a promise." The chair creaked once and went easy. They came in at a walk, dust hanging around them like old gossip, slow, deliberate, not trying to look like a threat and failing. 2 wagons with canvas bows, a coffin-maker's idea of a prairie schooner, the first rattled with the weight of a safe, iron-banded, and smug. 4 men on horseback, Bishop smiling small, his scar a whited seam. Finch, eyes jittery, as if mosquitoes lived behind them, a pair of quiet types with mouths like thin lines. And Keats, riding stiff, spectacles filmed with dust, hat too new for the company he kept. Bishop drew his horse 20 paces shy of the porch and tipped his hat to the ring that flashed against Clara's throat before he let his eyes rest on her face. "Morning, Miss Hale?" "Morning," she said. He looked around with appreciation that wasn't feigned, the patched chinks, the door that swung true, the yard neat as a wound tied off. "You've done fine work with the place." "Work's all I've got," she said. "Work and a low tolerance for nonsense." He laughed, not unkindly. "Well then, let's keep it sensible." He nudged his horse 2 steps closer and gestured with an open palm. "Ira here has brought the bank's portable safe, papers inside, contracts, notes, writs. He's a man of letters, Miss Hale. He believes in them the way some folks believe in God. He thought if you read the law with your own eyes, you'd see sense. Maybe sign where a woman in your shoes would be grateful to sign." "And you?" Clara asked. "Do you believe in letters?" "I believe in the pressure a line of ink can put on a man's throat," he said, smile flattening. "But I believe more in ending a story clean." "Then you know we already ended one," Clara said, "at the bank. With fire." A flicker went through his jaw. He kept his voice smooth. "Fire's a good liar. Paper burns, memory changes its tune. Law's what survives the heat.